Just when you thought it was safe to watch videos again on the internet comes Tales from Someplace Besides the Garage.
Well, I'm back. I don't have much to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. When I started doing videos, I had a lot of artists I could talk about. Naturally, going to my favorite artists. Then it became obvious to me I kind of ran out of things to talk about after having covered a lot of my favorites. And I could do what I've been listening to lately, but the problem is that changes just so rapidly. But anyway, like a lot of people out there that are music crazy like I am, music nuts, listening kind of changes day by day. And we discover a lot of things on YouTube, which is great, because back in the old days, if you read about an artist, and I mean literally read about an artist, and they sounded interesting, but you hadn't heard any of their music, you might go and go to a record store or whatever and pick something up, and it may or may not be something that works for you. Nowadays, you can sample just about almost anything, or certainly just about any artist, even if not a specific album. And when you're listening to something, it's weird because I've gotten into this thing sometimes where, because you could create folders on YouTube and put music in there or videos that you like in there, I've begun to do that, but I've been doing it with albums I already have in my collection, strangely enough. I was, as you listen to something, YouTube is always suggesting other things. So even if you start out listening on YouTube to an album that you already know and you already have in your collection, and you're listening to it on YouTube just because, for me, one of the reasons I listen to music on YouTube that I already own, that's readily available for me to play on my stereo or through my PC, because I load all my CDs into my PC, and I'm very much a CD guy versus a vinyl guy. I still like to listen on YouTube simply because you get to see people's comments. So, here I've got this album that I may have been listening to for 40 years or 30 years or something like that I know inside and out. The one thing that is different in the experience listening to it on YouTube is you could see people's comments if they've commented. There's some music that I listen to that's so obscure. I can recall just yesterday going into an album by a bunch of some jazz artists, and the album had been up on YouTube for about a year and a half, and there was all the individual tracks on the album were up as separate videos. And yet, all those, out of those, like 8 tracks on the album, whatever it was, they had only been listened to between 12 and 15 times in the year and a half that it had been up there. So you want to talk about obscure, But still, I wanted to hear, there was a classical album in my computer that I was all set to listen to, a Bartók album. And it's really, I think it's one of 2 Bartók albums I have, which is an album that I bought back in the late 80s. And I decided, you know what, instead of me just playing the CD, I'm going to see if this Bartók album is up on YouTube. And sure enough, the album in full is up on YouTube, and all the different movements for the symphony or whatever you want to call it, the work, as individual tracks. And I'm like, you know what, it's more fun for me to listen to it on YouTube when I can see people's comments. Because here's an album that I've known and I've had since the late 80s. And all of a sudden, for the first time, I'm listening to it on YouTube and creating a folder for it and putting it in there for future listens. But the one difference is I'm able to see what other people say about it. Now, in the case of classical music, there's usually less comments than there is for jazz and pop music, simply because there's less people listening to it, I guess. But in the classical world, the comments get a little bit different, because people tend to get very specific about which version of a piece is the best, and oh, this isn't as good as the 1959 recording and all that stuff. So it's interesting how passionate the classical listeners are and how much they know when they're commenting on a piece. They don't just know that piece on that version on that album, but they'll know 20 or 30 different versions recorded over the decades. And, they make suggestions. Oh, this version is better, under this conductor and, recorded in this year and this symphony orchestra and all that. It's interesting stuff. So it brings a depth, and not just the classical albums, the jazz albums and whatever, electronic music, whatever else I listen to. I'm finding it to be a whole new experience to listen to albums that I'm already familiar with for years and years, and instead of listening to them in my computer, listening to them on YouTube, so that as the videos pop by, you see people's comments. Especially interesting on older albums, I think. When you see something by like an early Klaus Schulze or Tangerine Dream album, something that I've been familiar with since the 1970s, and you see comments by younger people that have just stumbled across the album totally accidentally because of the way YouTube suggests things. And you see comments by these albums that I've lived with for 40 years, and people discovering them for the first time and saying, even the negative comments, but usually it's positive, or it's people saying, I've never quite come across anything like this. Because younger folks, even if they're into electronic music, are obviously probably starting with current stuff, stuff that is coming out now that maybe their friends listen to or whatever. That's more popular. And then through this YouTube magic, these older albums get suggested, and people go there. And of course, they're hearing things, even in the electronic world or the jazz world or whatever it is, they're hearing older things made on different equipment, especially in the electronic field, where the sound of the music, in addition to maybe the direction that the artist has taken, is very much kind of dictated by the equipment that was available. So all of a sudden, maybe somebody that's listening to electronic music in the 2000s gets suggested some old Klaus Schulze or maybe even a much more obscure artist than that, or Cluster or something like that, album from like the early 70s with that completely different technology and monophonic analog synthesizers and all that. And they're experiencing something that might be within the genre of music that they already listen to, but by the same token is so different. And it's not something that maybe a friend of theirs would have brought to their attention because their friends aren't aware of it being an older artist. So it's kind of interesting as you're listening to things, what YouTube suggests. And especially, even if you're listening to an old favorite, like I've been doing, is something that I'm very familiar with, YouTube pops up these suggestions. And sometimes YouTube will, based on what I'm listening to, YouTube will make a suggestion of something or an artist that I was familiar with that I haven't listened to for years. And that happened the other day. And I don't recall actually what I was listening to. But, or maybe it was from somebody's video, actually, where they all of a sudden showed an Eric Dolphy album. And I'm like, damn, Eric Dolphy is somebody that I had this period of time with back in the, probably the very early 80s, like 81, 82. And I had this period of a year or two or so that I bought a bunch of Eric Dolphy albums. Now, we're talking about vinyl, long before the CD era. And I really seriously, heavily got into him. And what happened is when the CD era came along, I was an early convert. I started buying CDs right away, so that would have been probably about 1985. 85 or 86. And I went nuts, so I was buying new albums that were things that were just being released back then. But a lot of my attention when I first started buying CDs was to pick up old favorite albums of mine that I had on vinyl on the CD format. So instead of listening to the crackly old vinyl that I had, I was suddenly listening to quieter, different versions. which actually would highlight a lot of, especially in the quiet moments, things that were previously unheard of for me because of the vinyl noise. And so I got, kind of drawn into the whole CD thing, and my albums kind of went by the wayside. And I would generally refer to them to read the liner notes or to look through my albums to figure out what I should get next on CD. It seems like when CDs came out, a good 75% or more of my purchases right off the bat were things I already had on vinyl versus new releases, or things that I didn't have that I was just buying on CD that I didn't already have on vinyl. But somebody, I know something popped up with Eric Dolphy, and then, which made me think of him. And then all of a sudden somebody showed an Eric Dolphy album and a video of theirs. And it got me to thinking now, I have a lot more CDs than I have of albums, and I tend not to go and refer back to my albums quite as much looking for things to get on CD, because now so many things have come out since the 80s when I stopped buying albums, that when I'm buying a new CD, it's usually, it might not be an album that recently came out, but it's usually something I didn't have on vinyl. But so somebody brought up this Eric Dolphy album. I'm like, yeah, man, I can remember back around 1981 or 1982, I went through this Dolphy period. And the only other time he came to mind was when I was doing a Tales from the Garage, where I've got a lot of my vinyl collection. I've got about 2/3 of my vinyl collection out in the garage, and about 1/3 of it here in the room. And it dawned on me the only real time I really ever even thought about Eric Dolphy since that early vinyl era was when I did a video and I randomly pulled out an Eric Dolphy vinyl that was back in my collection, because I was doing those random vinyl pulls where I go into the collection and I just pull out an album and talk about it, not knowing beforehand what album it's going to be. And I know I had pulled out 1 or 2 Eric Dolphys in those videos. That was literally the first time I even thought about him, I think, in all that time since the early 80s. So now, through YouTube and through somebody's video where they mentioned an Eric Dolphy album, I got curious. It's like, I looked around. I'm like, I couldn't believe that I didn't have any Eric Dolphy on CD at all. So, which means I haven't really seriously listened to Eric Dolphy since the mid 80s, since at least like maybe around 1985 or so. So I went to pull out my vinyl to see what I had, and it kind of started a whole new idea for a series maybe, and that's and because I'm more of a CD guy than a vinyl guy, so this may not be something that holds true for a lot of members of the VC, but I still have a turntable. It's defective. When I play, there's a couple things that go on which make me hesitate to use it when I turn it on. One thing is that when you play a record, one of the speakers sometimes cuts out, and you only have sound coming through one speaker. That's a problem. Another one is I haven't changed the cartridge. I don't know if I've ever changed the cartridge. I might have changed it once in all the years I had the turntable. Now, the turntable hasn't gotten used a whole hell of a lot since probably like 1990. But still, by that point, it was probably a good 10 years old. An Audio-Technica. It was a good turntable, but once I moved, and I don't know if this was a problem before, but I noticed once I moved to my location here, and I set the turntable up, I could hear a grinding coming from inside the turntable when the turntable's spinning. So there's something rubbing there, which isn't good. And also, it's something that could potentially come out on the speaker. If you're listening to very quiet music, or there's a quiet passage in the music, and the turntable's making this chugga-chugga sound, it's probably going to be picked up by the stylus, by the needle, by the cartridge, and a certain amount of that rumble is going to come through the speakers. So it's not the perfect sound scenario, really. So with that fact that I haven't changed the cartridge, and I hear that grinding coming from the turntable, and sometimes one of the speakers cuts out, the left or right, I don't remember which one. It's kind of, technically I have a working turntable, but I really don't in a way. So I haven't played much vinyl for over the years. There's been a few instances when I took a vinyl record I had, something that was never released on CD, and I played it as often as I needed to get a good copy of it into the computer. In other words, a copy where the speakers weren't cutting out kind of thing. Just so I could get it into the computer so I could burn it onto a CD or have the files on my computer so I could listen to it from there and not have to pull out the vinyl. So that's kind of the status of my turntable. I will, at some point, when I have some disposable income, I'm definitely going to buy another turntable. It obviously would be my last turntable of my life. But that's fairly high on my priority list, but there's things I need before that, obviously. Like necessity things that I need to fix around the condo and things like that. So I got started thinking that, there's a whole bunch of vinyl that, because I converted over to the CD era, and there's a lot of artists, and there's a certain amount, not much, probably less than maybe 15 to 20% of my collection are things that I would still like to hear nowadays, but I have never bought on CD. Maybe they came out on CD and they went out of print. Maybe they were never released on CD. Talking strictly the stuff that I have in my collection still. And it got me thinking, well, that could be a whole series of albums that I have on vinyl that I really can't listen to. I kind of could, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to subject my vinyl that's in pretty good condition to that turntable, which I think could destroy it, or at least cause undue wear. I'm not sure that the whole turntable is calibrated correctly, so I'm a little concerned of wear to the vinyl as well. And so I pulled out a bunch of things that even after all these years, and I probably have 85% of the albums that I really, really wanted on CD that I had in my vinyl collection, I've since picked up on CD. There's an elusive 5% that I really want bad that maybe never came out on CD, or that came out on CD and went out of print and I can't get. And then there's ones that I kind of slipped under the radar and forgot about. And then when I'm reminded, it's like, oh, damn, yeah, I would like to hear that again. And Eric Dolphy is one of those. Now, I got a bunch of vinyl here, and of course, it's not in order. So you have to give me a minute to get it in order. Oh, okay, maybe it is in order. So these are the only ones I could find. I thought I had more. But one of the first ones that I came across was also a very frustrating one. I barely remember picking this one up, too. And that is what I get. I don't know if it's a compilation. It's definitely a reissue on Everest Records, which I guess was a reissue label. The Everest Records Archive of Folk and Jazz Music, an album not titled, just called Eric Dolphy, guest artist Cannonball Adderley. And I guess it's, judging by the material, like Jitterbug Waltz, I would say it's an earlier thing. And I don't know if this is just a reissue of a very early session, or whether it's actually a complete album. The funny thing is, there's a really good biography on the back, or decent biography, just as they, typically back in the day, they wrote liner notes, which are nice to have. Sorry for the glare. And it's a brief, this was obviously put out after he passed away, at the age of 36, I believe it was. And they talk more about his career and his contribution to modern jazz. And they have a list of the 5 titles on the album, but they don't mention recording date. They don't mention if this was actually an album beforehand and what the album was, or what its title was, because there's no title. They list guest artist Cannonball Adderley. Don't even mention the instrument he plays. Don't mention recording dates or any of the other musicians involved on the album. And it's funny because it's kind of frustrating. I thought there might be an insert that explained all these things, but there wasn't. And it's interesting that they took the time to kind of write a career overview of Eric Dolphy without mentioning anything about the sessions the music came from, the dates that it was recorded. If it was even an Eric Dolphy, maybe Eric Dolphy was a sideman on these tracks at the time. Who knows? Don't mention any of the musicians involved except for Cannonball Adderley is a guest, but don't mention what tracks he plays on. It's one of those frustrating things that I mean, they still do it with the CD era now. You know, when they do compilations, a lot of times they might not give you any indication of where the material's coming from or the year it was recorded or anything. But moving on to an interesting one, supposedly, this is called Last Date. I don't know that this is actually the last recorded date. It's a great cover, though. I don't know specifically if this is the last Eric Dolphy date that was recorded. It's not a studio. It's a lot of his recordings are live recordings, and live recordings from Europe. And I believe this was recorded. I believe it's. Well, I think all the musicians are Dutch, so I'm guessing that's where it was recorded. Han Bennick is on drums. Now, was he Dutch? He's a name that I recognize from other dates, from other European jazz dates. The bass player, Mishka Mengelberg on piano, and Jacques Scholz on bass are two musicians I'm totally unaware of. So this is a quartet, a live date, and supposedly, I didn't really reread all the liner notes on here. This is supposedly one of the last recorded dates of his short life before he passed away. And he played there's a lot of live albums of his that came out from Europe, so it seems like he may have toured over there even more than in the U.S., or the Europeans were smart and they just recorded everything. The only problem with this is I didn't pull out the vinyl to listen to, but I did go and I found some of the tracks from this up on YouTube because I was really curious to hear it again. And the problem with it is, like a lot of live recordings at the time, because this would have been the 60s. When did he die? In the 60s? I want to say mid-60s he passed away. I'm pretty sure it's a mono recording. And their idea of recording live back then was stick one or two microphones in a room and you pick up the band playing, you know, which is sad because, first of all, this is kind of avant-garde jazz, so it's not mainstream jazz. And looking to an eye of this music staying alive, the only way for this music to really stay alive is for younger people to get into it. It's a little bit difficult because, number one, it's avant-garde music, so even fans of mainstream jazz might not be into it. Second of all, and this is really the thing that hurts younger people listening to it nowadays, I think, is because of the way these albums were recorded. They weren't recorded great, you know. Back in these days, live recordings didn't sound as good as studio recordings, and even studio recordings didn't necessarily sound that great unless you had somebody like a Rudy Van Gelder in the studio. It's definitely an art to recording that exists, and the quality just wasn't there. And what I listened to on YouTube from this album, the funny thing is the recording's very clear. You can hear clearly what the piano is playing and what the bass and the saxophone are playing. But there's absolutely no depth to it. If you've ever listened to music on an AM radio or you've heard a transistor radio or something like that, that's kind of what it sounds like. You know, it's very thin. There's no bottom. There's a lot of top. You know, there's the very thin sound on the top end. And the cymbals of the drums kind of cut through and everything. But there's no depth. There's no depth booming in the bass or the bass drum or anything like that. So even though it's clear to hear, it's going to be hard for younger people who are used to these, incredible recordings from the time that they grew up in an old digital world of, in-your-face bass and, just really extreme highs and lows and depth and the clarity of every instrument really coming through. It's just not there, and it's a shame. I don't know that there's anything that you can do with these kind of recordings to give them more depth. It basically sounds like somebody took a microphone, stuck it somewhere in the room. There wasn't a lot of people in the room, so it picked the band up. Like I said, you can hear the clarity is there, but there's no depth to the recording. And I'm afraid that's kind of the case with all of these, as I remember them, these Eric Dolphy live recordings, because of the time period they were done, and because in a lot of cases they may not have even been necessarily recorded as an album release, but especially in Europe, they were very big at recording anytime anybody played at a club, even if it wasn't necessarily meant at the time to be something commercially released. One of them that I actually did, I think, pretty sure pull out from a random vinyl pull of Eric Dolphy's was, this is his second album as a leader. I remember buying this pretty early. This was one of those original jazz classic reissues that came out in the early 80s. This is one of my, by the way, one of my favorite album covers of all time. It's got a style of art that you would never see nowadays. Even if somebody did a similar type of picture, they wouldn't quite do it this way. And I absolutely love that painting to this day. You got the floating bass and the cymbal at the top and all that. It's just it's just an awesome thing. I think the cover is what made me actually. I was going to the record store, I remember, to pick up some Eric Dolphy because I had read a lot of the artists that I was into at the time were heavily influenced by him, and at the time I didn't have any Dolphy, so I wanted to pick something up. Didn't quite know what to get. I saw the cover and it's like, I'm probably going to get this one. And then I saw the lineup and I'm like, wow, that sounds interesting. Because this isn't as avant-garde as maybe Eric Dolphy's music got a couple years later.
But had Roy Haynes on drums, is just a quartet, Eric Dolphy on saxophone and flute, George Duvivier on bass, an upright bass, and Ron Carter on cello. Really interesting. So there's no piano, no guitar. It's just the saxophone, the drums, the bass, and cello. So it's a real interesting quartet lineup, kind of like a chamberish thing. Very cool. And this is probably one of his better known albums. Another one that I picked up a bit later on. I haven't actually. This is definitely up on YouTube. I haven't played this in years. But look at that band. It's another interesting band. Besides Anthony Williams on drums, Tony Williams on drums, Richard Davis on bass. Another interesting group. Bobby Hutcherson on vibraphone. And Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. So it's this time a quintet. But again, not the typical thing with the piano in there. Instead of piano, you have the late, great Bobby Hutcherson on vibraphone. This is what I can remember listening to a lot back in the day, in the early 80s, and I don't remember a whole lot about it now. That's definitely a Blue Note cover, though. When you see that, that's very typical of the Blue Note era, that style of art. I've only got two more, and I pulled out a whole bunch of other vinyl that I was going to show that I'll save for another time. Probably my favorites, though, are the twofers, because I've spoken about in the mid to late 70s how they published a lot of the twofers that were two individual albums that they then combined into a two-album set for a reduced price. And one of the best things with twofers, besides getting twice the music at a very decent price, are the extensive liner notes that often came with them. And this is where you learn about not only about the artist's history, but about the particular sessions, at least the better liner notes that were written for the twofers. And most of them in the jazz world were very good on giving an overview of the guy's career, the artist's career, and of the specific recording dates encapsulated on this album, and how important they were to the artist's general canon of music. And these, the liner notes for this were written in 1973, which would tell you about the period that the twofer came out. And this had what was two individual albums, Eric Dolphy in Europe, Volume 1, and Eric Dolphy in Europe, Volume 3. Recorded September 1961. I've never figured out to this day why they included Volumes 1 and 3 and not Volumes 1 and 2, or 2 and 3 together. And I bought that, and I'm like, well, what the hell happened to Volume 2? Well, I have another twofer here. And the notes were written by Ben Sidran, if you know who he is. Once again, copious liner notes.
nice liner notes. I mean, this goes back to the days before computers when you would get an album and you would put an album on and you would listen to it and you would sit there and read the liner notes. And I specifically read them quite slowly so I could appreciate them and go through them. And I wouldn't even be through the liner notes when, I'd have to go and flip over the album to the other side. So this is another twofer. In this one, they put in, I'm looking for the titles. One of the albums is an album called Here and There, which I believe could be his Dolphy's very first album as a leader. I could be wrong, but I think Here and There was his first album as a leader. And strangely enough, the other album is Eric Dolphy in Europe Volume 2. So I don't know why they did that, why they put Volume 1 and 3 in a twofer together, and then number 2 separately, along with a studio recording. But yes, I want to say I think Here and There may have been his first album as leader. I could be wrong. Great liner notes, a lot. I love the twofers. Even when it comes to these twofer collections, even when I get them on CD, I tend to hold on to the albums because of the liner notes. Simply because of the liner notes, that whole experience of sitting there reading the liner notes while listening to the music. And I've done it where I've got the CD, put the CD on, and gone and pulled out the album and actually read the liner notes of the album, just like it was the old days. So, I really didn't have anything to talk about, and I've done it for over a half hour. So, this is just for me to be out there and put something else out there. And an appreciation for Eric Dolphy, which is probably going to be an artist that I'm going to start to maybe pick up on some of his stuff again on CD this time in the near future. So, hope everybody's doing well. Sorry for going on so long. I've got a first snowstorm of the year, really. Outside my window here, the entire branches of the big semi-tree that's right outside my window, absolutely covered in snow. It's very picturesque, but it's very dark and overcast by the same point. So, okay, guys, that's it for now. Sorry for going on so long. Take care. I'll see you next time.